The Lockbox from Kilbarra. A journey through old letters, older secrets, and the country roads of County Clare. Chapter 1. What the Attic Kept. My mother was not a mysterious woman. She was a practical woman, a Tuesday casserole and Sunday crossword woman. A woman who kept her tax returns in a color-coded accordion file and labeled every freezer bag with the contents and the date. She taught second grade in Columbus for 31 years. She made excellent pie. She told me she loved me every time we spoke on the phone, without fail. And she died in February of this year at the age of 78. Peacefully, in her own bed, without any discernible unfinished business. Or so I thought. I came to clean out her house in April, after the estate had been sorted and my brother Doug had taken what he wanted, and I had promised myself I would be organized and efficient about the whole thing. I am Sarah Calloway. I am 52 years old, literature at a community college in Cincinnati. I have been described by colleagues as methodical, and by my ex-husband as impossible to surprise, which he meant as a criticism and which I took as a compliment. I drove up to Columbus on a gray Saturday with a rental van, a box of bin bags, and a plan. I found the lockbox on my third day in the attic. It was behind a water heater that had not been used in 20 years. Inside a larger box labeled, "Winter Coats," in my mother's handwriting. It was metal, roughly the size of a shoebox, painted dark green, and it was locked with a small combination padlock of the old dial variety. It was also, I noticed immediately, heavier than it had any right to be. I stared at it for a while. Then I carried it downstairs, made myself a cup of tea, and went looking for a flathead screwdriver. The padlock was old enough that a screwdriver under the hasp was sufficient. The lid opened with a sound like a small, satisfied exhale, as if the box had been waiting a very long time for the right moment. Inside, on top, was a watch. A man's wristwatch, antique, with a cream dial and a slim gold case and a leather strap so old it had gone the color of autumn leaves. Even to my untrained eye it was beautiful. I turned it over. On the back, engraved in neat letters. For FM, with everything. R. C. 1973. Below the watch, wrapped in a cloth, was a handwritten journal. The cover was plain, dark blue, with no name. I opened it to the first page. From the journal. Undated preface. This is the account of what the three of us promised, in the summer of 1974, in the field behind Kilbarra House. If you are reading this, then one of us has gone, and the others must decide what to do. We were 22 and we thought we understood the world. We did not, but we understood each other, and we understood the promise, and that will have to do. M.H. M.H. My mother's maiden name was Margaret Halloran. I sat with that for a long moment. Under the journal was a map. Hand-drawn, not printed, on a sheet of heavy cream paper. It showed the outline of what appeared to be a small coastal village. A harbor, a church, a road, a house marked with an X and the name, Kilbarra House, and, in a bay to the north, a marker simply labeled, The Cave. In the bottom corner, written in different ink from the rest, County Clare, Ireland. My mother had never, in 52 years of my life, mentioned Ireland. She had never mentioned a place called Kilbarra. She had never mentioned a summer in 1974, or three friends, or a promise, or anything that might explain why a watch engraved to someone with the initials FM was in a lockbox in her attic behind a non-functioning water heater. I read the journal that night, cover to cover, with a glass of her good bourbon that I found in the kitchen cabinet, and felt absolutely certain she would have approved of my using for this particular purpose. By midnight, I knew 3 things. First, my mother had spent the summer of 1974 in a village called Kilbarra on the west coast of Ireland, working at a large house there, along with 2 close friends. A girl named Brigid Connolly and a young man named Finn Malone. Second, the 3 of them had made a pact, recorded in the journal, to protect a secret about Kilbarra House and its owner, a man named Alistair Drummond. That could, the journal said, bring considerable trouble to those who don't deserve it. Third, in August of 1974, Finn Malone had disappeared. The journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence, the week after his disappearance, as if my mother had simply stopped being able to write. There was nothing about what the secret was. Nothing about what happened to Finn. Nothing about the watch, or why it was there, or what the initials RC on its back might mean. I closed the journal. I looked at the map. I thought about my brother Doug, who was perfectly capable of handling the rest of the house clearance. I thought about the 6 weeks of summer term still remaining in Cincinnati. I thought about the methodical, impossible to surprise woman I was supposed to be. I booked a flight to Shannon Airport on my phone before I went to bed. Chapter 2. The Road to Kilbarra. I will say this about driving on the left side of the road in a country where the hedgerows grow close enough to scrape the wing mirrors. It concentrates the mind wonderfully. By the time I reached County Clare, 2 days after landing in Shannon, I had stopped thinking about my syllabi, my ex-husband, my dim sense that 52 had arrived without asking whether I was ready, and every other persistent interior noise that usually occupied the back of my mind. I was thinking entirely about not hitting stone walls. I had rented a small blue Fiat that the young man at the desk had described as nippy, which turned out to be a charming Irish word for inadequate on hills. I had the hand-drawn map on the passenger seat next to the more authoritative one from my phone, and I had the journal in my bag, reread twice on the plane and once in the bed and breakfast in Ennis where I'd spent my first night. I knew more, now, from rereading carefully. The journal ran from May to late August of 1974, covering the 3 friends' work at Kilbarra House, which had been, that summer, operating as a kind of informal artists' retreat run by Alistair Drummond, a wealthy Anglo-Irish landowner my mother described as charming when sober and frightening when not. Finn Malone, 22 years old, had been a gifted painter. Brigid Connolly had been a musician, fiddle and flute, who'd grown up in Kilbarra itself. My mother had been the writer among them. The pact they'd made, in the field behind the house in July of 1974, was to say nothing about what they had found. A set of documents in Drummond's study, accidentally discovered by Finn, that revealed he had been systematically defrauding a family named Malone. Finn's own family. Of a significant inheritance. Kilbarra House and the land around it had, according to these documents, been purchased with money that legally belonged to the Malones, derived from a trust set up by Finn's grandfather. Drummond, who had been the trust's solicitor, had redirected the funds over a period of years using instruments that were complex enough to be deniable. The pact had been made, my mother wrote, because Finn was afraid. He believed Drummond knew he'd seen the documents, and he was frightened of what a man like that might do. They agreed. Say nothing until Finn had spoken to a solicitor in Dublin. Wait. Be careful. 3 weeks later, Finn went for an evening walk along the cliff path north of the village, and never came back. The search had lasted 4 days. His body was never found. The verdict, eventually, was accidental death by misadventure. The cliffs were known to be unstable, the path unlit. Drummond had expressed condolences. The summer at Kilbarra house ended. My mother went home to Ohio. She had never spoken of it. Not once, in 52 years. Kilbarra announced itself with a hand-painted sign on a stone pillar and a lane so narrow I had to fold the wing mirrors in. The village was small and very beautiful. A row of painted houses facing a harbor, a pub, a church on a rise. The Atlantic enormous and silver gray beyond the headland. It looked like a postcard of itself. I parked near the harbor and sat in the Fiat for a moment, looking at the map and then at the village and then at the journal entry my mother had written on her first day here in 1974. It looks like the edge of the world. And not in a frightening way. In a way that makes you feel there is a great deal of world still to find. I was 52 years old, sitting in a Fiat that was inadequate on hills, in a village in County Clare, in pursuit of a story my dead mother had kept from me for my entire life. I had no particular plan. I had no idea what I was looking for, precisely, or what I intended to do with it if I found it. I felt, unexpectedly, completely alive. I went to the pub. Chapter 3. Brigid and what she remembered. The pub was called O'Brien's, which in Ireland is not a particularly distinctive name for a pub, but this one had a framed photograph of the village taken in 1970 hanging above the bar, and I stood in front of it with a glass of Guinness. My first, and genuinely much nicer than I'd expected. And studied it carefully until the woman behind the bar said, "You're looking at something specific." "I'm looking for a house," I said. "Kilbarra House. And possibly for a woman named Brigid Connolly, if she's still in the area." The woman behind the bar. Her name turned out to be Aoife, pronounced Aoife, which I was glad to learn before attempting it. Regarded me with the particular unhurried evaluation that I was beginning to associate with rural Ireland. Then she said, "Brigid Connolly is Brigid Ford now. She lives up the coast road about 2 miles, the white house with the green gate. She teaches fiddle to children on Tuesdays." A pause. "What do you want with her?" "My mother knew her," I said. "A long time ago. My mother died recently and I found something that I think belongs to Brigid's family. Or to mine. I'm not entirely certain." Aoife considered this. "Your mother's name?" "Margaret Halloran. She was here in 1974. Something moved across Aoife's face. Recognition, or something close to it. "I'll call ahead," she said, and reached for the phone before I could reply. Brigid Ford was 73 years old, white-haired, compact, and energetic in the way of people who have spent a lifetime moving. She met me at her green gate with the alert eyes of someone who'd been waiting for a visit without knowing it. When I told her my mother's name, she took my hand in both of hers and held it for a moment without speaking. "Come in," she said. "I have scones." We sat in her kitchen for 3 hours. She talked. I listened and occasionally read from the journal. And she would stop me and correct a detail or add a memory, and then she would go quiet for a bit and look out the window at the Atlantic, which was visible from her kitchen table in a way that I found extraordinary. She confirmed everything the journal said. The summer, the documents Finn had found, the pact, the fear, the disappearance. And then she told me the part that wasn't in the journal. "Finn didn't fall off the cliff," she said, setting her teacup down with careful precision. "I have believed that my whole life, though I could never prove it. He was a careful boy. He knew those paths since childhood. And Drummond. The morning after Finn disappeared, Drummond left Kilbarra house, took his car and drove to Dublin. He said it was business. He never spent another summer here. You told the police this? I was 22 and terrified, she said, with a look that was not an apology. And what did I have? A feeling. A timing. Drummond had powerful friends. His solicitor was the county's most prominent man. My father told me to keep quiet and I was young enough to listen. She looked down at her hands. Your mother felt the same. We wrote to each other for some years afterward. Then it became too painful and we stopped. But I never forgot Finn. I took the watch from my bag and set it on the table between us. Brigid looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Where did you find this? In the lockbox with the journal. It's engraved on the back. For FM. RC. RC was Ronan Connolly, she said quietly. My uncle. He was a watchmaker in Ennis. He made this watch for Finn the year before. She picked it up with a steadiness I admired. Finn was wearing it the day he disappeared. The police noted it in their report. He was wearing a gold wristwatch when he was last seen. She turned it over and looked at the engraving. How did your mother have it? I don't know, I said. The journal doesn't say. We sat with that for a while. Outside, the Atlantic continued its untroubled business. There's something else, Brigid said eventually. Something I found out much later. Drummond died in 1998. No children. When the estate was wound up, a solicitor in Dublin contacted the county council about Kilbarra House, trying to establish whether there were any prior claims on the land. There were some inquiries made about the Malone family. But Finn's parents had died by then, and no one could find any living relatives. She looked at me steadily. Your mother would have known this. She maintained a P.O. box in Columbus that she used for correspondence with me. We exchanged a few letters in the late 90s when Drummond died. She told me she was looking into it. And then the letters stopped. She didn't tell me any of this, I said. No, said Brigid. I suspect she was protecting you. She wouldn't have wanted to raise a hope she wasn't sure she could deliver. A small pause. But she kept the box. And she kept the journal. And she left them where you'd find them when she was gone. She tilted her head. That's not an accident, Sarah. Your mother was the most deliberate woman I ever knew. I thought of the accordion file of tax returns. The labeled freezer bags. The color-coded everything. Yes, I said. She was. There's a solicitor in Ennis, Brigid said, and stood up to refill the kettle. Name of Fogarty. She specializes in historic land claims. I've had her card for 20 years, waiting to give it to someone. She looked over her shoulder. I think that's you. Chapter 4. What Drummond left behind. Katrina Fogarty was 48 years old, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck with the confidence of someone who had stopped caring what anyone thought about it, and had, she informed me pleasantly on the phone, been maintaining a file on the Kilbarra house estate question for 11 years on a speculative basis because, as she put it, something was clearly wrong with the 1974 land transfer and it annoyed me. I liked her immediately. I drove to Ennis the next morning, carrying the lockbox and the journal and the watch, and spent 4 hours in Fogarty's office above a chemist's shop on a narrow street behind the cathedral. She spread everything on her desk and examined it with the careful attention of someone who had been handed exactly what she needed, and was taking care not to show how pleased she was. "The watch is significant," she said, turning it under her desk lamp. "Not for its monetary value, though that's considerable. This is a Patek Philippe from 1958. And I would estimate its current value at somewhere north of €40,000. It's significant because it was listed in the police report as being on Finn Malone's person on the day he disappeared. If your mother had it, then either she found it afterward, or..." She set it down carefully. "Someone gave it to her." "You think Drummond gave it to her?" "I think Drummond, or someone acting for him, may have given it to her as a kind of warning or payment to ensure her silence." She looked at me over her glasses. "Your mother kept it. She did not sell it, did not use it, did not show it to anyone. She put it in a box with the evidence and locked it away. That is not the behavior of someone who was bought. That is the behavior of someone who was biding their time." I sat with that image of my mother. 22 years old, frightened, furious, locking a box in an attic and waiting 30 years for the right moment. And felt something complicated and warm settle in my chest. Now for the legal tangle, which Fogarty explained with the patience of someone accustomed to translating complexity into plain language. Finn Malone had died intestate, without a will, and with no known surviving immediate family. However, the trust from which Drummond had stolen the inheritance had been established by Finn's grandfather, Cormac Malone, in 1951, and its terms, which Fogarty had obtained copies of from the Irish Land Registry, were specific. The principal and accumulated interest were to pass to Cormac's descendants in equal share. If Finn had no descendants, the trust reverted to any living descendants of Cormac's siblings. Cormac Malone had a brother, Padraig. Padraig had emigrated to the United States in 1948. His daughter, Fogarty continued, checking her notes with what I now recognized as theatrical restraint, had married in Columbus, Ohio, in 1969. Her name had been Ellen Malone. She had taken her husband's name upon marriage. Her married name was Ellen Halloran. I heard this and did not say anything for a moment because I was quite busy recalibrating the entire structure of my understanding of my family history. My mother. Margaret Halloran, nay what, exactly? But no. Ellen Halloran was my grandmother. My mother was Margaret, Ellen's daughter. My grandmother was a Malone, I said slowly. Your grandmother was Padraig Malone's daughter, Fogarty confirmed. Which means your mother was Cormac Malone's great-niece. And Finn Malone was her first cousin once removed. She paused. She went to Kilbarra in 1974 to work at an artist's retreat. But she may also have gone because she felt a pull toward the place her grandmother's family had come from. Many Irish-American families did, in that era. Another pause. And she found, by extraordinary chance, that the man running the house had stolen her family's inheritance. She knew, I said. She knew the connection. The journal. She never explains why she went there. I assumed it was just the job. But she knew. I think she must have, Fogarty said gently. Which is why Drummond giving her the watch was so cruel. He was telling her, I know who you are. I know what you found. And I am not afraid of you. I thought of my mother at 22, alone, a long way from home, being handed a dead man's watch by someone who meant it as a threat. Going home to Ohio. Putting it in a box. Raising her children. Teaching second grade for 31 years. And all that time, keeping the box, keeping the record, keeping the evidence for someone. Keeping it for me. What happens now? I asked. Fogarty folded her hands. Drummond died in 1998. His estate passed to a nephew who sold Kilbarra house to a property developer in 2003. The house itself is a hotel now. A rather nice one. The land claim is more complicated. But she allowed herself a small smile. The trust itself was never legally dissolved. The funds that Drummond redirected were traced, partially, during the estate proceedings in 1998, and a sum was held in escrow by the Dublin solicitor pending any claimant coming forward. It has been sitting there for 27 years, accumulating interest. She slid a document across the desk. The current figure, as of last month, is approximately €460,000. I looked at the document. Then I looked at her. This will require a formal claim, she said, and a probate process to establish your lineage, which will take some months. I cannot promise there will be no complications. But I can tell you that the documentation you've brought me today, the journal, the trust records I already hold, and the genealogical trail, constitutes a strong foundation. She paused. Your mother spent 50 years preserving this evidence. She knew what she was doing. Yes, I said. She usually did. I drove back to Kilbarra that evening along the coast road as the sun went low over the Atlantic, turning the water the color of a very old painting. And I thought about my mother at 22 walking this same road. And my grandmother Ellen, who had come from this county and crossed an ocean and raised a family without ever mentioning where she came from. And Finn Malone, who had gone for a walk one August evening and not come back. There was grief in it. But there was also, oddly, unexpectedly, something like completion. A thread that had been left hanging for 50 years, picked up and followed to its end. I had one more thing to do before I could go home. Chapter 5. The Cave, and Coming Home. The cave marked on my mother's map was north of the village, accessible at low tide by a path down the cliff face that was newer than the one Finn would have walked in 1974, fitted now with a rope handrail and stone-cut steps that a succession of local councils had installed for walkers. I knew this because Brigid had told me, on my second visit to her kitchen. There had been scones again, and this time also excellent brown bread. And she had also told me something else. We used to go there, the three of us, she said. The cave was our place. We called it the archive. She smiled at the word. Finn said we should leave a record there. Something permanent. He was terribly romantic about it, in the way that 22-year-olds are. He wrote our names on the cave wall in charcoal and said that in 100 years someone would find them and wonder who we were. She had not been back since 1974. Would you come with me? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I'll wear sensible shoes. We went on a Thursday morning, when the tide was low. In the clear bright light that County Clare produces occasionally in May, as if to prove it is capable of it. The path was manageable. Brigid was more sure-footed than me on the steps. And the cave itself was broad and dry at the entrance, narrowing toward the back, smelling of salt and cold stone and something ancient that I found, rather than oppressive, deeply peaceful. The charcoal names were still there. Faded but legible, high on the cave wall where the salt spray didn't reach. Finn. Brigid. Maggie. Summer, 1974. Brigid stood very still looking at it for a while. I did not say anything. Some moments need room. Then she said, "He had such good handwriting," in a voice that was perfectly steady. And I understood that she had been carrying this for 50 years and that it was not a burden she would set down all at once. But that having someone to stand beside while she held it was something. I had brought the watch. I had thought about this a good deal, about what to do with it. Fogarty wanted it catalogued as part of the claim. Brigid's family had made it. It had belonged to Finn. It had been used against my mother. It was worth a considerable sum. I had decided that it should stay with Brigid. When I gave it to her, standing in the cave with the Atlantic light coming in from the entrance, she held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "Are you certain?" she said. "It was your uncle's work," I said. "It should be in Kilbarra." A pause. "Or, if you preferred, it could be donated to the local museum, if there is one, in Finn's name, so that the name is here, permanently, in the village." She looked up at that. "There is a small heritage museum in the village hall. They have been trying to build a collection." Her voice was thoughtful. "A Patek Philippe from 1958, made by a local watchmaker, with a documented history." Yes. Yes, that would be right. She closed her hands around it gently. "I'll speak to them." We walked back up the cliff path in the late morning sunshine. Brigid held the rope rail with one hand and talked about Finn. His painting, his laugh, the way he could make any room feel more interesting simply by being in it. And I listened and thought about how stories survive. Not in the telling, always. Sometimes in the keeping. Sometimes in a locked box in an attic, waiting for the right person to come looking. I stayed in Kilbarra for another 5 days. I walked every path on my mother's hand-drawn map. I sat in O'Brien's pub and let Aoife introduce me to people, which she did with the proprietary confidence of someone who considers the social architecture of a village her personal responsibility. I visited Kilbarra House, which was indeed a hotel now. Handsome, sympathetically restored, with the original stone walls. And a bar where they served a local whiskey. That I thought was probably too expensive and was absolutely worth it. I sat in the garden behind the house, where the field had been, and tried to imagine 3 22-year-olds making a solemn promise in the summer of 1974. Not knowing what any of it would cost. I called my brother Doug from the garden. I told him everything. There was a long silence, and then he said, "Mum, honestly." Which is what he always says when she surprises him, present tense, and I found that I wasn't as sad about this as I might have expected to be. I called Fogarty twice that week to answer questions about the genealogical documents she needed. She was efficient and encouraging and once said, in passing, that she had always known the Kilbarra House case would resolve itself eventually, and the equanimity with which she said it suggested she had simply been waiting for the universe to cooperate, which is perhaps the correct attitude for someone who works in historic land claims. On my last evening, I had dinner with Brigid at her kitchen table. The Atlantic going gold and then dark through the window, and she told me about her own life. Her marriage, her children, her decades of teaching music in County Clare. And I told her about mine. And at some point she said, "You seem surprised to be here." And I thought about it and said yes, I supposed I was. You seem to be enjoying it, she said. I am. I said it and realized I meant it completely. Not in the way of a holiday or a distraction, but in the way of something clarifying. A lens that had been slightly out of focus for years, adjusted at last. I had come here because of a lockbox. I had found, alongside the evidence and the inheritance and the 50-year-old secret, something harder to name but easier to feel. The sense of a life with more texture than I had been allowing it. I was 52, which I had been treating as a kind of diminishment, a winding down, the far side of things. My mother had been 22 in this very county, on the edge of the world, and she had found it enormous with possibility even while she was frightened. She had come home, and built a life, and kept a secret, and trusted me. Eventually, in the only way available to her. With the thread she hadn't been able to follow herself. She would have liked you, I told Brigid. I know, she said. I liked her very much. I was sorry we lost touch. A pause. I hope you will not be a stranger, now that you've found us. I drove to Shannon the next morning in the inadequate Fiat, with the lockbox on the passenger seat, the journal in my bag, and a card from Brigid with her number and the words, "Next time bring walking boots," written on the back. I was already thinking about August. The community college had a provision for sabbatical leave, which I had never used. I had a cousin once removed who deserved a proper memorial somewhere in the village record. I had a solicitor in Ennis who would need my signature on a good many documents over the coming months. And I was beginning to suspect, a great deal of walking still to do on the cliff paths of County Clare. Learning the routes my mother had walked at 22. At the edge of the world, finding it not frightening but full. The flight home lifted into the grey Irish sky and banked south over the Atlantic, and I watched the coastline. Jagged, green, impossibly beautiful. Until it disappeared into cloud. In my bag, the journal. In my memory, the cave wall. Finn. Brigid. Maggie. Summer, 1974. 4 names now, if you counted the one she'd left for me to add. I thought I would go back and do that, in the charcoal, in August. I thought my mother would have wanted me to.